So we start off by saying we decided this, when in reality the other thing was true. So we state the thises in terms of context of our null and alternative hypothesis. Okay. As far as consequences go, as far as why we want to pick type 1 versus type 2, those aren't locked in by the type of error. It's more a result of what happens in the real world when we make this type of choice. So consequences are more contingent upon who's asking the question versus that we're dealing with type 1 or type 2 error. Okay, so going back to a murder trial, what exactly is the hypothesis and null for a murder trial? Well, the null is that the defendant is innocent, and the alternative is that the defendant is guilty. In other words, I'm trying to gather evidence that the person actually did the crime, and if I'm unsuccessful, then we go with the idea that the defendant is actually innocent. In this context, then, what exactly is a type 1 error? Well, a type 1 error is I set out to decide the defendant is guilty when in fact they are innocent. So in other words, I gather evidence and I was successful in convincing people that he's guilty, and in reality I shouldn't have, but just the evidence I had supported that conclusion. A type 2 error, on the other hand, is okay, so we go out and to gather evidence about their guilt, and if I come back and say that they are not guilty when in fact they are guilty, that would be type 2. So in other words, I try to gather evidence and I'm not successful, but I should have been. That's what type 2 error refers to. Okay, what about consequences then? Because now that we're talking about type 1 and type 2, what happens if we make one of those types of decisions and we go down that particular road with that? Well, in type 1 error is when I decide a defendant is guilty when in fact they're really innocent. And so for us, in our country, that would mean an innocent person goes to prison. Type 2 error would be we decide they're not guilty when in fact they are. And so for us, that means that we let a guilty person go free. Now, while this is a simple thought experiment, the question to kind of think about is what do we consider worse in our society? Not every country in the world believes the same way about these sorts of ideas. So where do we sort of fit on this spectrum as far as what would horrify us more? Are we more upset as a culture when an innocent person goes to prison, or does it upset us more when a guilty person actually gets off and doesn't get a penalty? And for us, debatable, but I think for the most part, we built our system up so that we don't want an innocent person to actually sit in jail. The trade-off is if we do that, that means occasionally a guilty person will go free, just because we have a stricter set of rules and guidelines to ensure that an innocent person doesn't go to prison. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but we tend to view that as a worse crime, whereas other countries wouldn't feel that strongly about it. Okay, so every time we make a decision, we have some sort of potential to have an error, just based on how rare the data is and what's actually happening in the real world. Interesting enough, the alpha and the beta, the type 2 and the type 1 error, are inversely related, which simply means if I don't want type 1 error to occur, that means I loosen up the standards for type 2 error to occur. And if I'm horrified by type 2 error, that means the standards for type 1 error are loosened. And so there's a higher chance for whichever error I happen to value the more, there's a stronger likelihood that the other error would occur out in the real world. So as alpha decreases, beta increases, is sort of the idea. And then the reverse being true, as alpha increases, beta decreases. Okay. Now, out in the real world, the seriousness of the error is determined by the who's asking the questions, determined by the sort of the context of the data, the context of the investigation, and it's not always guaranteed that type 1 or type 2 would consistently be more serious in real life. In all honesty, most of the time we don't even know if an error in real life is made. In other words, when CEOs and other big companies make these types of decisions, we as consumers don't really know if they had all the facts or not, so we really don't get to see the consequences of these errors, except in a few cases where it actually makes the news. Like for example, Firestone Tires were trying to cut corners on costs and loosened up their standards on production, and so they were making tires cheaper, but people were out there driving on the road and tires were exploding, and people were actually dying. So that made the news, and so now we're interested in the quality of tires. Then you've got drugs like Fen-Phen and Vioxx that were designed to weight loss but cause people to have heart attacks. So we're aware of those types of errors when people make those decisions, but those are extreme cases. Usually we don't get to see the types of errors don't really impact us all the time. All right, so let's look at some illustrations of hypothesis tests and errors, and just kind of paint ourselves a picture of how this works. So we're going to look at a chip company decides to accept a truckload of potatoes based on the results from the sample of potatoes from the truckload. So truck pulls up, they grab, I don't know, they get a bucket, they grab a scoop of potatoes, and they're going to analyze that sample thoroughly and check for qualities and health issues and that sort of thing. And then based on what they find from the sample, they're going to decide whether to accept the entire shipment or not. So this is kind of something that happens consistently out in the real world. So what would our hypothesis statement be? Well, you got to really stop and think, why am I gathering evidence? When I'm checking the potatoes, why does it matter, right? Am I going to be, in other words, am I looking for bad or am I looking for good? I'm checking because I want to see if I've got a bad sample. So I'm looking for evidence of bad. And if I don't find any, then I'm just going to think that the entire shipment is good. Okay? What would a type 1 error be? Well, if I'm trying to gather evidence that the potatoes are bad, type 1 error means I'm successful, but I shouldn't have been. So I'm able to decide the potatoes are bad when they are really good. Okay, for type 2 error, this is where I try to see if the potatoes are bad, and I'm not successful, but I should have been. So I decide the potatoes are good when they are really bad. Okay, now, which one is the worst error? Which is more serious? And this really depends on from whose viewpoint. From the supplier's viewpoint, type 1 error is a lot worse, and the reason being, I've got a good I got a good truck full of potatoes, and you tell me they're bad, and you're not going to pay me money for them. From the company's point of view, they happen to think type 2 is worse because here they've accepted this shipment of potatoes, and it's going to ruin their supply. Customers are going to be outraged, whatever. It's potatoes. But again, the seriousness depends on who's asking the question in the statement. Okay, water samples are taken from water used for cooling as it's being discharged from a power plant into a river. It's been determined that as long as the mean temperature of the discharged water is at most 150 degrees Fahrenheit, there'll be no negative consequences on the river's ecosystem. To investigate whether the plant is in compliance with regulations that prohibit a mean discharge above 50 water samples are taken at random selected times, and the temperature of each sample is recorded. Okay, so the science behind this is if you've got a power plant, you need to use water to cool down things, and your discharge, you're sending out hot water into rivers and streams and that sort of thing. Well, it turns out living things don't like hot water. You and I, as human beings, wouldn't appreciate having water that was too scalding. 150 isn't boiling yet, but I really wouldn't want to, you know, 100 degrees outside is kind of hot enough for me. So in this case, what would our hypothesis be? Well, what am I gathering evidence for? What is it I want to see is happening? So if you really think about it, I am gathering evidence to see if the water is too hot. So my alternative is that the mean is actually greater than 150 degrees. So that means my null would be that it is 150. Okay. What about type 1 and type 2 errors? Well, type 1 means I'm trying to gather evidence for it to be greater than 150, and I succeed when I really shouldn't have. So type 1 would be decide the temperature is above 150 when it's really below. Type 2 would be decide the temperature is not above when in fact it really is. So I think it's too low and shouldn't be. And again, which one is more serious? So you got to think from all the different perspectives. You know, what would the power plant people say? What would the environmentalists say? And in this particular case, I think most people, if you really think about the consequences, would decide that type 2 is worse. You know, type 2 means we're allowing this water to ruin the habitat, and I think that generally most people would think that that's more important than electricity, I guess, or power, but whatever.